Manchuria, August 9, 1945, 4,000 hours, and 23-year-old Kimiko Tanaka stood at the window of the Harbin Municipal Hospital nursing dormitory, watching the first hints of dawn paint the horizon in shades of amber and rose, completely unaware that within 72 hours her entire world would collapse into chaos so absolute that she would spend the next 4 years fighting not for victory or glory, but simply for survival in a frozen wasteland where 24,000 Japanese women would vanish into a nightmare from which they would never return home. A catastrophe so devastating that the Japanese government would later offer substantial payments to any survivor who could provide testimony about what happened during those missing years, a desperate attempt to piece together a tragedy that officials had tried to bury beneath layers of silence and shame for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the scent of coal smoke from the city's industrial district, and Kimiko could hear her fellow nurses beginning to stir in the adjoining rooms, their soft conversations filtering through the thin walls as they prepared for another day of tending to the soldiers and civilians who filled the hospital's wards. The war had been going badly for Japan, everyone knew this, though speaking such thoughts aloud was dangerous, even here in Manchuria, where the puppet state of Manchukuo had been under Japanese control since 1932. Kimiko had arrived in Harbin 18 months earlier, recruited along with hundreds of other young Japanese women to serve as nurses in the expanding colonial infrastructure that Japan had built across northeastern China, promised good wages and the honor of serving the emperor in the great mission to bring prosperity to Asia under Japanese guidance. She finished pinning her hair into the regulation style and smoothed the white fabric of her nursing uniform, checking her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin to ensure she met the strict standards of appearance that matron Yoshida enforced with relentless scrutiny. Kimiko had grown up in Fukuoka, the daughter of a textile merchant who had fallen on hard times during the Depression, and nursing had seemed like a respectable path for a young woman whose family could no longer afford to provide a substantial dowry. The training had been rigorous, the discipline harsh, but Kimiko had discovered that she possessed both the stomach and the compassion required for medical work, and she had been proud when she received her assignment to Manchuria, seeing it as an opportunity to prove herself capable and independent. But lately, the atmosphere in Harbin had grown tense in ways that worried even the most optimistic Japanese residents. Soviet forces had been massing along the Manchurian border for months. Everyone whispered about it in the markets and tea houses, though official proclamations from the Kwantung Army headquarters insisted that the USSR would honor its neutrality pact with Japan and that Manchukuo remained secure under Japanese protection. Kimiko wanted to believe these assurances, but she had noticed how the senior officers at the hospital had begun speaking in hushed tones, how supply shipments had become irregular, how the best troops seemed to have been quietly withdrawn southward toward the home islands, leaving Manchuria defended by increasingly green conscripts and older reservists who looked exhausted before they even reached the front lines. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the city, unusual for August, and Kimiko frowned as she peered out the window again, searching the clear sky for storm clouds that should accompany such rumbling. The sound came again, deeper this time, and with a cold shock of recognition, Kimiko realized it was not thunder at all, but artillery fire from somewhere far to the north, a sustained barrage that suggested something far more serious than the occasional border skirmish that had occurred sporadically over the past few years. She pressed her hand against the window glass, feeling it vibrate slightly with each distant concussion, and a knot of fear began to form in her stomach as she understood that the war had finally come to Manchuria in earnest. Within hours, the hospital descended into barely controlled chaos as wounded soldiers began arriving from the northern defense lines, men with terrible injuries who spoke in shell-shocked voices about massive Soviet tank columns that had smashed through Japanese positions like a tsunami overwhelming a seawall. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese military power in Asia, was collapsing under an assault of overwhelming force and speed, and the Soviet offense was driving south toward Harbin with such velocity that refugees from outlying settlements were already flooding into the city, bringing stories of atrocities and destruction that chilled the blood of everyone who heard them. Matron Yoshida assembled the nursing staff in the hospital's main corridor that afternoon, her normally stern face showing cracks of concern that frightened Kimiko more than any rumor, because the matron had always projected absolute confidence regardless of circumstances. The older woman informed them that the military situation was fluid. That was the term she used, fluid, as though the complete disintegration of Japanese control over Manchuria could be described with such a clinical word. She instructed the nurses to prepare for a possible evacuation southward toward Korea, to pack only essential items, to remain calm and await further orders. But even as Matron Yoshida spoke these words with practiced authority, Kimiko could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the recognition that orders might never come, or might come too late to matter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan at midnight on August 9, 1945, exactly 3 months after Germany's surrender in Europe, honoring the commitment Stalin had made to the Western Allies at the Yalta Conference to enter the Pacific War once the European conflict concluded. The timing could not have been worse for Japan, which was already reeling from the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 3 days earlier and would suffer a second atomic attack on Nagasaki later that same day. The Japanese government was paralyzed by internal debates about surrender terms, about whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration's demand for unconditional capitulation, about how to preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation. And while Tokyo's leaders argued, the Soviet military machine rolled across Manchuria with devastating efficiency, deploying 1.5 million troops supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft in a blitzkrieg operation that would prove to be one of the most successful offensive campaigns of World War II. The Kwantung Army, which had numbered over 700,000 men at its peak, had been systematically stripped of its best divisions over the preceding year, with veteran units transferred to defend the Philippines, Okinawa, and ultimately the home islands themselves against the anticipated American invasion. What remained in Manchuria in August 1945 was a hollow force, undermanned, poorly equipped, lacking adequate air support or anti-tank weapons, commanded by officers who had been assured that the Soviets would not attack and who had made no serious preparations for defending against a major offensive. When the storm broke on August 9th, the Kwantung Army's defensive lines shattered almost immediately, and within days the situation had deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. Kimiko worked through that first day and into the night without rest, helping surgeons who were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of casualties, holding the hands of dying soldiers who cried out for their mothers, changing blood-soaked bandages and trying to maintain sterile procedures even as the hospital's supplies dwindled and the chaos outside intensified. She had seen suffering before during her time in Harbin, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the scale of trauma and the desperate knowledge that most of these men would die regardless of what the medical staff attempted. By dawn on August 10th, Kimiko was so exhausted she could barely stand, but there was no possibility of rest because the wounded kept arriving in trucks and wagons, each load bringing more evidence of the disaster unfolding across Manchuria. On August 12th, 3 days after the Soviet offensive began, officials from the Kwantung Army headquarters arrived at the hospital with evacuation orders that had finally been authorized by Tokyo. All Japanese civilians were to withdraw southward immediately, heading for the ports along the Korean coast where ships would supposedly transport them back to Japan. The military would organize the evacuation in an orderly manner, protecting the civilian columns as they moved through territory that was rapidly falling under Soviet control. Matron Yoshida gathered her nurses and informed them they would depart within hours, that they should collect their belongings and assemble at the train station where special cars had been reserved for hospital personnel and other essential workers. Kimiko rushed back to the dormitory and threw her few possessions into a small suitcase, her hands shaking as she tried to decide what to take and what to abandon.
She grabbed her nursing diploma, a photograph of her family, a few changes of clothes, some money she had saved, a small prayer book her mother had given her when she left Japan. Everything else would have to be left behind, all the small accumulations of her 18 months in Manchuria, the books and letters and trinkets that had made the dormitory room feel like home. She took one last look around the narrow space, knowing she would never see it again, then hurried downstairs to join the other nurses who were gathering in the hospital courtyard. The train station was absolute pandemonium when they arrived, thousands of Japanese civilians pushing and shoving to board trains that were already packed beyond capacity, families separated in the crush, children crying, elderly people trampled by the desperate crowds. The special cars that had been promised for hospital staff did not exist or had been commandeered by military officers who were abandoning their posts and fleeing south ahead of the Soviet advance.
Eventually, through a combination of determination and pure force of will, Matron Yoshida managed to push her group of nurses onto one of the overcrowded cars, and they pressed themselves into a space barely large enough for half their number, standing body to body in the stifling heat with no room to sit or even shift position. The train lurched into motion hours behind schedule, crawling south at a maddeningly slow pace because the tracks were clogged with military traffic and refugee trains, because the railway system was breaking down under the strain of moving hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously, because the entire infrastructure of Japanese Manchuria was collapsing in real time. Kimiko stood wedged between two older nurses, barely able to breathe in the crushing press of humanity, listening to the sounds of panic and despair that filled the railway car. A woman near the door was weeping hysterically, calling out the name of a child she had lost in the chaos at the station. An elderly man was praying aloud in a trembling voice, reciting sutras he probably had not spoken since childhood. Someone fainted from the heat and lack of air, but there was nowhere for the unconscious body to fall. It simply remained upright, supported by the surrounding crowd. Hours passed in this nightmarish compression, the train stopping and starting with no explanation, the August sun turning the metal railway car into an oven that baked everyone inside. When darkness fell on that first day of the evacuation, the train was still barely 50 kilometers south of Harbin, having covered a distance that should have taken 2 hours, but had required more than 8 because of the constant delays and disruptions. Kimiko could hear explosions in the distance, whether from Soviet artillery or demolitions carried out by retreating Japanese forces, she could not tell. The railway car had no lights, so they traveled through the darkness, blind and terrified, each unexplained stop bringing fears that Soviet troops had blocked the tracks ahead, each jolt and lurch threatening to send the overcrowded train off the rails entirely. On August 15th, as Kimiko's refugee train crept southward through the Manchurian countryside at a crawl, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation via radio for the first time in history, announcing, in archaic court language, that Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and surrender unconditionally to the Allied powers. The war was over. Japan had been defeated. The unthinkable had occurred. But for the hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians trapped in Manchuria, the emperor's surrender announcement brought not relief, but terror, because they understood that Soviet forces would have no reason to show restraint now that Japan had capitulated, that the protection of being citizens of a belligerent power would vanish, leaving them vulnerable as refugees in a hostile land. The Kwantung Army, what remained of it, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force within days of the emperor's broadcast. Officers abandoned their commands and fled south, trying to reach Korea or the coast before Soviet troops could cut them off. Enlisted men deserted en masse, discarding their uniforms and weapons, attempting to blend in with civilian refugees or simply hiding in the countryside hoping to survive until they could somehow make their way home. The military units that had been tasked with protecting the civilian evacuation columns dissolved like salt in water, leaving tens of thousands of Japanese women, children, and elderly people to fend for themselves in the middle of Manchuria as Soviet forces swept across the region.
Kimiko's train made it as far south as Mukden before the railway line ahead was cut, either by Soviet troops or by Chinese resistance fighters who were taking advantage of the chaos to settle scores with the Japanese occupiers who had brutalized Manchuria for 13 years. The train stopped at a small station outside the city, and officials came through the cars announcing that everyone would have to disembark, that there would be no more trains going south, that they would have to walk the remaining distance to Korea. Walk? Kimiko thought with disbelief. Walk hundreds of kilometers through hostile territory, with no food, no shelter, no protection? It seemed impossible, suicidal. Yet there was no alternative.
Matron Yoshida gathered her nurses on the station platform as the thousands of refugees began streaming away from the trains, a human river flowing south along the roads and paths that led toward Korea and safety. The matron counted heads to ensure all her staff were present, then addressed them in a voice that remained steady despite the desperate circumstances. They would stay together as a group, she announced. They would look after each other and help the civilians who needed medical assistance along the way. They were nurses. They had sworn oaths to care for the sick and injured, and their professional duty did not end simply because the war had. Kimiko felt a surge of pride at these words, a sense that even in the midst of catastrophe, there could be purpose and dignity if they chose to uphold their principles. The march south began that afternoon, and within hours, Kimiko understood that many of the people walking alongside her would never reach Korea. The column of refugees stretched for kilometers in both directions, thousands upon thousands of Japanese civilians trudging along dusty roads under the brutal August sun with inadequate supplies and no organized support. Children struggled to keep pace with adults. Elderly people collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind because there was no way to carry them. Pregnant women went into labor by the roadside with no medical care available except what Kimiko and her fellow nurses could provide with their bare hands and whatever materials they could improvise. Soviet cavalry units appeared on the second day of the march, mounted troops who rode parallel to the refugee column at a distance, watching but not immediately attacking. Their presence was deeply unsettling because everyone knew stories about what Soviet soldiers had done to German civilians during the advance through Eastern Europe. Stories of violence and revenge that had been passed along through military channels and private letters. The refugees quickened their pace despite their exhaustion, driven by fear of what might happen if the Soviets decided to ride in among them. But there was nowhere to flee, no way to move faster than the slowest members of the group. That night, as the refugees made camp in a field beside the road with no tents or adequate supplies, the first attacks occurred. Groups of Soviet soldiers moved through the camp after dark, selecting young women and dragging them away, despite the screams and protests of family members who tried to intervene. Kimiko huddled with the other nurses around Matron Yoshida, who had ordered them to stay close together and to look as unattractive as possible, to cover their hair and smear dirt on their faces and avoid drawing attention. But these precautions proved inadequate when Soviet troops with flashlights began systematically searching through the groups of refugees, and Kimiko watched in horror as several of her fellow nurses were seized and pulled away into the darkness. She could hear their screams throughout that terrible night, sounds that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The cries of women being assaulted while hundreds of refugees listened helplessly, too terrified to intervene, knowing that resistance would mean death, not just for themselves, but for their families and companions as well. When dawn came, the women who had been taken stumbled back into the camp, their clothes torn, their faces blank with shock and trauma. Matron Yoshida gathered them quietly and did what she could to provide medical care and comfort.
But there were no words adequate to address what had happened, no training that prepared nurses to cope with this particular kind of horror. The march continued, day after terrible day, with the refugee column shrinking steadily as people died from exhaustion, disease, starvation, or violence. Children were particularly vulnerable, unable to endure the physical demands of walking 20 or 30 kilometers daily with minimal food and water. Kimiko helped bury dozens of small bodies along the roadside during those weeks, wrapping them in whatever scraps of cloth could be spared and saying brief prayers before the column moved on, leaving the unmarked graves behind. The parents of these dead children would stagger away from the burial sites with faces like stone, having no time to properly mourn because survival demanded they keep walking, keep moving south toward a safety that seemed to recede further into the distance with each passing day. By early September 1945, Kimiko's group had made it only as far as the outskirts of Changchun, still hundreds of kilometers from the Korean border, when Soviet military police established roadblocks and began forcibly stopping the refugee columns. Officers with lists and interpreters moved through the crowds, separating people into different categories based on criteria that seemed arbitrary and incomprehensible to the terrified Japanese civilians. Men of military age were detained immediately, accused of being Kwantung Army soldiers attempting to escape, and marched away under armed guard to destinations unknown. Families were torn apart as fathers and sons were separated from wives and mothers, the women's desperate pleas falling on deaf ears as Soviet guards used rifle butts to enforce compliance. The nurses were identified as medical personnel through documents they carried and the distinctive white armbands they wore, even in the chaos of evacuation. A Soviet officer who spoke passable Japanese informed Matron Yoshida that her staff would not be permitted to continue south, that they were being conscripted to provide medical services for Soviet forces and for the growing population of displaced persons who were flooding into the cities now that Japanese control had collapsed. Matron Yoshida protested that they were civilians, protected under international law, that the war was over and they had the right to return to Japan. But the Soviet officer simply laughed at these appeals to legal niceties and informed her that she could either cooperate voluntarily or be compelled to cooperate through less pleasant means. Kimiko and approximately 80 other nurses from various hospitals and medical facilities across Manchuria were loaded onto trucks and transported to a former Japanese military barracks on the northern edge of Changchun that had been converted into a Soviet administrative compound. The conditions shocked them immediately because the barracks had been stripped of everything valuable. The windows were broken, there was no running water or functional sanitation. The buildings were filthy and damaged from recent fighting. Soviet guards herded the women into one of the larger structures and informed them through an interpreter that this would be their quarters, that they would report for medical duty each morning at dawn, that attempting to escape would result in immediate execution. The reality of their situation crystallized in Kimiko's mind as she stood in that derelict barracks, surrounded by frightened women whose hopes of returning home had just been shattered. They were prisoners, though the Soviets did not use that term officially, preferring euphemisms like detained personnel or requisitioned workers. But the armed guards at the doors and the threats of violence for non-compliance made their status clear enough. The Japanese government had surrendered. The emperor had ordered all military forces to lay down their arms, but for Japanese civilians trapped in Manchuria, the war had not ended, but had instead transformed into something worse, a liminal nightmare where they existed without protection or rights, subject to arbitrary power of Soviet military authorities who viewed them as spoils of conquest. The medical work they were forced to perform proved grueling and often disturbing. Soviet military hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers from the Manchurian campaign and from casualties being shipped west from fighting that continued in other theaters. The facilities lacked adequate supplies, antibiotics were scarce, surgical instruments were primitive or improvised, and the Soviet medical staff treated the Japanese nurses as slave labor to be worked to exhaustion without regard for their well-being. Kimiko spent 16-hour days assisting with amputations and wound debridement, preparing bodies for burial, cleaning operating theaters with cold water and harsh lye soap that left her hands cracked and bleeding. But the medical duties were not the worst aspect of their captivity. Soviet officers and even some enlisted men believed they had unlimited access to the Japanese women under their control, and the assaults began within the first week.
Guards would enter the barracks after dark and select women to be taken away, sometimes returning them hours later, sometimes keeping them for days at a time. Matron Yoshida attempted to organize a system of protection, having the nurses sleep in groups and posting watches throughout the night. But these measures proved inadequate against armed men who had the backing of military authority and who faced no consequences for their actions. Kimiko survived the first 2 months of captivity without being assaulted herself through a combination of luck and the protection of older nurses who deliberately drew attention away from the younger women when Soviet soldiers came prowling. But in late October, her luck ran out when a Soviet medical officer named Captain Volkov noticed her during her shift at the hospital and decided he wanted her for himself. Volkov was in his 30s, a surgeon from Leningrad who spoke no Japanese and who treated Kimiko not as a person but as property he had acquired through the fortunes of war. For the next 3 months, Kimiko was kept in Volkov's private quarters, forced to serve him in ways that destroyed something fundamental in her soul, enduring treatment that she could not speak about even decades later without her voice faltering and her hands beginning to shake. When Volkov was transferred to another posting in early 1946, he simply abandoned Kimiko like discarded furniture, and she returned to the barracks to find that many of her fellow nurses had suffered similar or worse fates. The women did not discuss these experiences among themselves because the shame was too overwhelming, because Japanese cultural attitudes about female purity meant that they viewed themselves as irredeemably tainted, as damaged goods who could never return to normal lives, even if they somehow made it back to Japan. This psychological trauma would prove as lasting and destructive as any physical injury, creating wounds that would never fully heal, regardless of how many years passed. Winter in Manchuria brought temperatures that plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, and the barracks where the nurses were housed had no adequate heating system. The women burned whatever scraps of wood they could scavenge, huddling together for warmth during the brutal nights, waking each morning to find that some of their companions had died from exposure or illness during the darkness. Pneumonia and tuberculosis swept through their ranks, and without proper medicine or nutrition, their bodies had no resources to fight off infection. Kimiko watched women she had trained alongside, friends she had relied on for emotional support, waste away and die in those freezing barracks, while Soviet authorities refused to provide adequate food or medical care for their captive workforce. By spring of 1946, approximately half of the nurses who had been detained with Kimiko in September 1945 were dead, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in a field behind the compound. The survivors existed in a state of numbed resignation, performing their assigned duties mechanically, no longer speaking about home or rescue or the future, because such thoughts brought only pain. The Japanese government had signed surrender documents and was now occupied by American forces, but there was no indication that anyone in Tokyo knew or cared about the fate of Japanese civilians stranded in Soviet-controlled Manchuria. The nurses had been forgotten, written off as acceptable losses in the larger calculus of Japan's defeat and occupation. Soviet policy regarding Japanese prisoners and detained civilians in Manchuria was driven by Stalin's determination to extract maximum benefit from the conquered territories.
Hundreds of thousands of Japanese men were shipped to labor camps across the Soviet Union, particularly to remote regions of Siberia, where they were forced to work in mines, on construction projects, and in timber operations, under conditions that killed them by the thousands. The official rationale was that these men were being held to perform reparations labor, compensation for the damage Japan had inflicted on the Soviet Union, though in reality this was simply slavery dressed up in legal language. Japanese women in Soviet custody occupied a different but equally exploitative category.
Those with professional skills like nursing, teaching, or clerical work were retained in Manchuria to support Soviet administrative and military operations. Others were put to work in factories, on farms, or in service industries that the Soviets were establishing in the region. All existed in legal limbo, neither formally arrested nor free to leave, subject to whatever demands Soviet authorities chose to make, without recourse to any form of justice or appeal. The women were essentially chattel, human resources to be utilized until they were used up and discarded. Kimiko learned of other groups of detained Japanese women through conversations with Chinese civilians who worked in the Soviet compound. There were reports of several thousand women being held in similar conditions in Harbin, another large group in Mukden, smaller concentrations scattered across Manchuria wherever Soviet forces had established administrative centers. The total number was impossible to determine with any accuracy, but estimates suggested at least 20,000 Japanese women were being held in Soviet custody across the region, with another 4,000 or more having died during the initial evacuation attempts or in the early months of detention. Communication with Japan was impossible. Letters were not permitted, and the women had no way to inform their families that they were alive and being held against their will. For all practical purposes, they had vanished from existence, disappeared into the vast Soviet occupation zone in northeastern China, with no trace of their whereabouts or fate. Families in Japan who had received no word from their daughters or wives or sisters trapped in Manchuria could only assume the worst. And indeed, the truth was often worse than what they imagined, because the systematic abuse and exploitation that these women endured was beyond what most people in Japan could conceive. The months dragged into years with no change in their circumstances. 1946 passed, then 1947, and Kimiko marked time by the changing seasons and the gradual depletion of the women around her. The nursing staff that had numbered 80 when she was first detained had dwindled to fewer than 30 by the end of 1947, with the missing either dead or transferred to other locations for reasons no one bothered to explain. New groups of Japanese women would occasionally arrive, detainees from rural areas who had been discovered hiding in Chinese villages or living in the countryside after failed escape attempts, and these new arrivals brought fragmentary news of the situation in Japan and rumors about repatriation negotiations. The Tokyo government, under occupation administration, had begun pressing the Soviet Union to release Japanese prisoners and detain civilians, initiating diplomatic discussions that made frustratingly slow progress through 1946 and 1947. Stalin's government acknowledged that some Japanese nationals were in Soviet custody, but refused to provide accurate numbers or timelines for repatriation, using the detained Japanese as leverage in larger negotiations about peace treaties and reparations. Meanwhile, thousands of Japanese prisoners died in Siberian labor camps, and thousands of detained women like Kimiko continued to suffer in Manchurian holding facilities with no end in sight. In early 1948, Soviet authorities began screening the detained Japanese women in Changchun, conducting interviews to determine who would be permitted to return to Japan in the first wave of repatriations. The process was opaque and seemingly capricious, with selections based on criteria that made no logical sense to the detainees. Women who had family connections to important Japanese officials were sometimes prioritized, but not always. Those who had collaborated with Soviet authorities or provided useful intelligence were given preference, but this was not consistently applied. Medical personnel were initially excluded because the Soviets claimed they were still needed, but then small numbers would be suddenly approved for departure without explanation.
Kimiko was not included in the first repatriation group that left Changchun in March 1948, watching from behind the compound fence as approximately 200 Japanese civilians boarded trains heading for the port of Nakodka, where Soviet ships would transport them across the Sea of Japan to Maizuru and freedom. She felt a surge of desperate envy watching those trains depart, knowing that she might have to wait months or years for another opportunity, if such an opportunity ever came at all. Many of the women left behind believed they would never be released, that the Soviets intended to keep them indefinitely as unpaid labor, and this belief eroded what little hope remained in their hearts. The physical toll of nearly 3 years in Soviet custody had aged Kimiko far beyond her actual years. She was now 26 but looked 40, her hair streaked with premature gray, her face deeply lined from stress and malnutrition, her body thin and weak from inadequate food and chronic illness. Her hands, which had been steady and skilled when she first trained as a nurse, now trembled constantly from nerve damage caused by frostbite and overwork. She suffered from recurring nightmares about the assaults she had endured, waking in terror several times each week, her screams disturbing the other women who shared the barracks and who understood because most of them carried similar trauma. In August 1948, Soviet authorities conducted another round of screening interviews, and this time Kimiko's name appeared on the approved list for repatriation. She learned of this from a Chinese interpreter who informed her with bureaucratic indifference that she should prepare to depart within 2 weeks. Kimiko felt a complex mixture of relief and disbelief, unable to fully trust that she would actually be permitted to leave after 3 years of captivity, fearing that the approval would be revoked at the last moment for some arbitrary reason. She owned almost nothing after years of detention, just the clothes she wore and a few small items she had managed to keep, so preparation consisted mainly of psychological adjustment to the idea that her nightmare might finally be ending. The day of departure arrived in early September 1948, exactly 3 years after Kimiko had been detained at the roadblock outside Changchun. A group of approximately 150 Japanese women from various detention facilities in the city were assembled at the railway station under Soviet guard and loaded onto freight cars for the journey to the coast. The conditions were harsh, with minimal food and no sanitation facilities, but none of the women complained because anything was bearable if it meant they were finally going home. The train took 5 days to reach Nakodka, traveling through the vast emptiness of Soviet Asia. And during those 5 days, Kimiko allowed herself to hope that she might actually survive this ordeal and return to the life she had lost. At Nakodka, the repatriation process revealed its full bureaucratic cruelty. Soviet officials conducted extensive final interviews with each returnee, demanding detailed information about their time in Manchuria, their work assignments, anyone they had contact with, essentially extracting intelligence while simultaneously creating official records that documented nothing about Soviet mistreatment of detainees. The women were medically examined, deloused, issued plain clothes to replace their ragged garments, and photographed for identification documents. The entire process took nearly 2 weeks, during which they were held in a transit camp with marginally better conditions than what they had endured in Changchun, but still under armed guard with no freedom of movement. Finally, in late September 1948, Kimiko and approximately 800 other Japanese repatriates boarded a Soviet transport ship for the crossing to Maizuru.
The vessel was overcrowded and uncomfortable, designed for cargo rather than passengers, but the knowledge that Japan lay just across the water made even seasoned detainees weep with relief. Kimiko stood at the rail as the ship pulled away from the dock, watching the Soviet coastline recede, and felt the weight of 3 years of captivity pressing down on her with such force that she could barely breathe. She had survived, she was going home, but what would home mean now that everything had changed beyond recognition? The crossing took 36 hours through rough seas that left most passengers violently seasick,
But when the Japanese coastline finally appeared through the morning mist, a collective sound rose from the repatriates, something between a cheer and a sob, the cry of people who had believed they would never see their homeland again. The ship docked at Maizuru on October 1, 1948, and Japanese officials from the Ministry of Health and Welfare came aboard to begin the processing that would officially return these people to Japanese society after years of absence. But the reception Kimiko and her fellow repatriates received was far colder than they had anticipated. Japanese society in 1948 was struggling with the trauma of defeat and occupation, with food shortages and economic chaos, with the psychological burden of having lost the war and having to rebuild from ruins. Repatriates from Manchuria and other former Japanese territories were viewed with suspicion and resentment, seen as burdens on an already overstretched system, as people who had somehow failed by allowing themselves to be captured or detained when they should have died honorably instead. The women who returned after years in Soviet custody faced additional stigma because of widespread assumptions about what had happened to them. Assumptions that were largely accurate, but that made these women unmarriageable and socially contaminated in the eyes of traditional Japanese culture. Kimiko traveled by train from Maizuru to Fukuoka, a journey that took her through a Japan she barely recognized, cities destroyed by bombing, countryside impoverished, people who looked defeated and hungry everywhere she looked. When she finally reached her family home and knocked on the door, her mother opened it and stared at her for several long seconds before recognition dawned. Her mother began to cry, pulling Kimiko inside, but the reunion was shadowed by unspoken questions and by the knowledge that Kimiko's father had died 2 months earlier, weakened by malnutrition and stress, never knowing that his daughter had survived and would return. In the weeks that followed, Kimiko attempted to reintegrate into Japanese society and found it nearly impossible. Her younger sister had married and moved away, uncomfortable with having a tainted older sister whose presence might damage the family's reputation. Her mother tried to help, but did not know how to address the trauma Kimiko carried, falling back on traditional exhortations to endure and to not speak of shameful things. Neighbors whispered when Kimiko walked past, rumors circulating about what she must have done to survive 3 years in Soviet custody, assumptions that were both cruel and partially accurate, but that made her an outcast in the community where she had grown up. Employment proved difficult because potential employers saw her years in Manchuria as a gap in her work history that raised questions she could not adequately answer. Her nursing credentials were still technically valid, but hospitals were reluctant to hire repatriates, particularly women repatriates, because of the stigma attached to them. Kimiko eventually found work in a textile factory, manual labor that paid poorly and that bore no relation to her medical training, but she was grateful for any income and any routine that helped structure her days. At night, alone in the small room she rented after her mother's house became too uncomfortable, Kimiko would think about the women who had not returned, the thousands of Japanese women still being held in Soviet custody or who had died during detention. She learned through repatriate organizations that sporadic releases continued through 1949 and into the early 1950s, with small groups being sent back to Japan as Soviet-Japanese relations slowly normalized.
But many women never returned, either because they died in captivity or because they chose to remain in China rather than face the stigma waiting for them in Japan, or because Soviet authorities simply never released them for reasons that were never explained or documented. The Japanese government's official position on the detained women of Manchuria evolved slowly and inadequately over the following decades. Initial estimates of casualties and missing persons were deliberately low, downplaying the scale of the catastrophe to avoid embarrassing questions about why Japanese authorities had failed to protect civilians during the evacuation. As more repatriates returned and shared their stories, the true scope of the tragedy became harder to ignore, but official acknowledgement remained incomplete and grudging. Compensation programs were eventually established, but the amounts were insultingly small and came decades too late to materially help most survivors who had spent years or decades living in poverty and social isolation. Historians would later estimate that approximately 24,000 Japanese women were detained by Soviet forces in Manchuria and adjacent territories between August 1945 and late 1946. Of these, roughly 12,000 died during the initial evacuation period or during the first 2 years of detention from exposure, disease, malnutrition, violence, or suicide. Another 6,000 were eventually repatriated between 1946 and 1956, returning to Japan with varying degrees of physical and psychological damage. The remaining 6,000 either died in continued detention, remained in China by choice or circumstance, or simply disappeared into gaps in the historical record with no documentation of their ultimate fate. The women who did return, like Kimiko, carried scars that never healed despite the passage of decades. Many never married because of the social stigma attached to them, living solitary lives in which they rarely spoke about their experiences, even to family members. Some struggled with what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks and panic attacks and depression that went untreated because Japanese society in the 1950s and 1960s had little understanding of or sympathy for psychological trauma. A significant number died by suicide in the years after repatriation, unable to reconcile what they had endured with the expectations of the society they had returned to. Kimiko lived until 2003, reaching the age of 81 through sheer endurance rather than any joy in living. She never married, never had children, worked various menial jobs until she was too old to continue, then survived on a small government pension that was barely adequate. In her final years, living in a tiny apartment in Fukuoka, she occasionally gave interviews to historians who were documenting the experiences of Manchurian repatriates, though even then she could not bring herself to discuss many details of what had happened during her 3 years in Soviet custody. Her death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but anyone who knew her story understood that she had really died decades earlier on the frozen plains of Manchuria, and her body had simply taken 55 additional years to catch up with that reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.